Well, the world was understandably gripped this week by Donald Trump's rather surprising suggestion that the US might take ownership of Gaza and turn it into what he's called the Riviera of the Middle East. Now, whether this was his intention or not, the bombshell announcement did take a lot of attention away from something else the president had done just a day or two earlier. Donald Trump began to roll out his grand tariff strategy, the one we heard so much about during his election campaign. And it is something that deserves a lot more attention. His threats to impose hefty tariffs on both Canada and Mexico didn't actually eventuate, at least not yet. But a new 10% tariff on Chinese goods did. And China didn't take this hit lying down. It's responded with trade sanctions of its own. So is this the beginning of a wider US-China trade war? And what does that mean for Australia? That's what I'm keen to explore. I'm David Spears on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Steve Hamilton is an Australian economist based at George Washington University in DC, but he's here in Canberra for a few days as he regularly visits down under. Great to see you here in the Canberra studio, Steve.
Cheers, mate.
So, look, let's start with what happened on the trade front. As I mentioned, a lot of this was overshadowed later in the week by the Gaza comments from the president. But what did he do on trade?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One thing is he made a lot of threats and he came very close, right? He played a game of chicken and only got out of the way at the very last minute. And that had the effect of, I think it shocked a lot of us. It certainly shocked me. I really did. I was shocked that he was going to go through with it. But then at the last minute, it didn't happen.
And you can't have been too shocked by that because we spoke on US Election Day in Washington. I was talking to you about what he was promising on tariffs and so on. And you did have a note of caution that let's just see if this is a negotiating tactic or something real. So has it proven to be a negotiating tactic?
Well, a negotiating tactic would require you to win something.
What did he get?
He got nothing.
he got some border czar or some beefed up border controls.
Right. He got things that were already happening. He got a border czar, a fentanyl czar in Canada, which is sort of really nothing. And so I think, there are two issues. One, we got a tariff on China, and that's real, right? That's not nothing. And as you said, we got a bit of retaliation.
And I want to come to China in a minute, but
yes,
just sticking with Canada and Mexico. So he gets a border czar to try and stop the fentanyl. I guess there's a bit of doubt as to whether it will stop the fentanyl that's been flowing across the borders for decades.
No.
But why then did he back off?
Yes, so I think that, what we got was we got a lot of threats and then we got him pulling out at the last minute. I really do believe he intended to do it. I think, ultimately you have to understand Trump believes in tariffs. Right, he is what we would call a mercantilist, right? So Trump has this brain in the 19th century when the US was a closed economy. They got most of its tax revenue from tariffs. He really does believe it. He loves them, right? And that's despite universal opposition to tariffs by economists, right? And evidence.
He says it's one of his beautiful word. After God, religion, love, then comes tariff.
Yeah, that's what he believes. And I think, I can't argue. It's wrong, obviously, but that's what he believes. So I really do think he intended to do it. But obviously, if you understand how integrated the North American economies have become over the last 30 years since NAFTA was implemented in 1993, they're like one big economy. It would be like putting a tariff between Queensland and New South Wales, right? Or even worse, actually, because, a steel might be produced in the US. They'll send steel billet down to Mexico. They melt that down, turn it into a bolt. That gets sent to Canada, put it in a transmission. That gets sent back to the US.
It's a seamless economy.
It's, and what he wanted to do was every time something crossed one of those borders, it gets hit with a 25% tax. Right. And those things build.
And
right?
Who's paying ultimately?
Well, it has two effects, right? On one hand, obviously that eventually gets passed through to consumers in some way. But
American consumers.
Of course, and Canadian and all of them, right? But the bigger issue is that it's massively economically disruptive, right? So you are taking these delicate, intricate supply chains and you're shattering them, right? So, something that is built up over decades, overnight you're saying no more, right?
So this is important. Does Donald Trump not understand that? Because he talks about tariffs being used to raise money from foreign countries, from other countries. And he can use that money to not only help boost industry in America, but to lower taxes. You get this revenue from tariffs
Yes.
that allows him to lower taxes for Americans. That's not how they work.
Well, it can't do both things. A tariff can't protect America and cut off imports, because if it does, you don't raise any money, right? So either the tariff raises money or it makes America an autarky, right? You can't do both. So I would say, you asked before, why did he not do it? He thinks it's going to be fine. The markets aren't stupid. The markets know it's not going to be fine.
So what happened on the markets?
Well, they collapsed, right?
So he announced it, right. They really took it.
And they fell once, and then he came out and he was very defiant. And then again, he came out and eventually he buckled. Right?
And that's because of the market reaction, you think?
Exactly, because they know how economically
and
damaging
he pays
this
attention
is.
to the stock market. He sees a plunge in the markets
Yes.
as a reflection.
As a reflection on him.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, look, it's worth mentioning that, he makes this claim repeatedly that we can use tariffs to replace the income tax. We can get rid of the income tax. It can solve all problems. The tariffs would raise about $100 billion in that order, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that the US deficit is $2 trillion.
Right.
And the US debt is $36 trillion, right? So,
But I'm still stuck on the fundamental, when you say it would raise money, the
Yes.
tariff. How does it raise money?
Yeah, so I think, you could obviously raise tariffs to the point where they don't raise money because you've shut all imports, right? That's one extreme. In the middle,
But if you're buying a Canadian widget in the US,
yes,
it's simply putting up the price of that Canadian widget, isn't it? It's not collecting money.
this is complicated.
We can handle it.
It's a sort of complex economic question. But here's the fundamental truth, which is, during the election campaign, Kamala Harris said American consumers will pay for the tariffs. She said that literally. She came up with a number that American consumers would pay, which was how much they import multiplied by the tariff, right?
Yep.
And she said that's Donald Trump's tax on American families. On the other hand, Donald Trump said China pays the tariff, right? Both of those were lies. Both of those were wrong.
Right.
It's wrong to say all of it is on China. It's wrong to say all of it is on America. Like anything an economist usually says, it's somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between.
Right. And so there's a sort of what we call incidence, how much of the tariff we bear and how much they bear. And that is entirely determined by our alternatives, right? If I'm a business and now I've got a tax, if I ship to you, I'm gonna try and ship to someone else instead. And if I can do that, then I'm not going to bear the burden, right? So there's a complex economic question about how much will be borne by American consumers and workers and how much is borne by foreigners. There is some argument for tariffs that suggests if foreigners are paying some of it, we should do it. But to be honest, there's a bigger, more important question, which is if you introduce tariffs, yes, they'll pay some, but what are they going to do in response? They're going to retaliate, and then you're going to retaliate, and then we end up spiraling.
Which brings us neatly to China.
Yes.
Because this turned out not to be a threat. He's gone ahead with this 10% tariff, additional tariff at this stage. It's on top of various tariffs that he brought in first time around that Biden kept in place. So an extra 10%. Why did he press ahead with those, as opposed to dropping the threat against Canada and Mexico?
Yes, I think we've got to you want to distinguish between two types of tariff motivations. There's the sort of Donald Trump mercantilist, we're going to make America great again by collecting revenue from foreigners and all that stuff. That's one. The other one is a genuine strategic tool, right? And I think you can think of the Chinese tariffs in that way. Trump in his first time implemented strategic tariffs against China. So did Biden. He kept some and did some of his own, and Trump is doing these, right? So, there is you cannot underestimate the genuine fear in America of China. I get on planes and I tell people I'm an economist, and the first thing they say is they start talking about China.
So whereas with Canada and Mexico, the aim might be trying to do something about the immigration and fentanyl problems on the border.
With China, and the economy, right? To try and build America's economy back up again,
sure,
that kind of thing.
But with China, it's a much more serious, longer term, strategic and economic concern about China.
Look, I want to easier to justify. I think like if there is any justification for tariffs, it has to be the strategic argument. I'm still not sure it is justified, but that's the way you would justify it. And if you look this last week, I mean, think about the AI war that's going on and this deep seek kind of issue of realizing that American AI was actually not as far ahead as we thought, and the Chinese actually have a big leg up in that basis. These sorts of things fuel the fear of Americans that they're going to lose the number one spot in the world to China, right? So there is a genuine desire to economically impair the Chinese economy. Right? And that's what the tariffs do.
And so China responds, as I mentioned. They've hit back with an additional, retaliatory measures on a range of US goods at this stage. Is this the beginning of a wider trade war between the two?
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, it clearly is. Nobody knows where it's going to end, right? I think the bigger question is, yes, we know they're going to fight, but what are the implications for everybody else, right? Does China try and build relationships with alternative countries, with Europe, right, for example? Obviously, how does Australia respond to this? Because, what America is trying to do is impair the Chinese economy. Australia fuels the Chinese economy with our iron ore and coal exports and LNG exports, right? So it's very awkward, right, for a country like Australia. Obviously, so the question is how this will kind of play out in the coming years.
So what do you think for Australia? Is this good or bad news economically?
Look, I don't think the 10% tariffs will make a huge difference, right? The Chinese economy is already slowing significantly, right? They're experiencing deflation, right? Price decreases. And that's why the terms of trade have come off. That's why, a lot of the revenue estimates have come down compared to before.
Which is not great for Australia.
No. So on one hand, it's obviously bad for our national income. It does actually have a little bit of a disinflationary effect, right? Because there's a little less demand for Australia, which cools the economy a little bit, which helps the RBA. So that one channel is actually good, right? In that
and if
sense.
Chinese goods are going to be more expensive in the US, do more of them cheaper Chinese goods end up here?
Exactly.
Pushing downward pressure on prices.
Exactly. The Chinese have to send them somewhere, and that can be disinflationary. Now, obviously, it's inflationary for America, but for other countries, it's disinflationary. So that's helpful. I think it's not huge. I mean, we look at, the implications for Australia are in the sort of tens, 20 billion in terms of our economic activity. It's not huge, right? It's a little bit at the margin.
This is based on the 10% tariff and China's response. But if it gets more
then
serious from here.
Then it could be serious, right? If the US does serious damage to the Chinese economy, that will have a big flow and impact to us. If you look at the place in Australia where the incumbent government is going to do best in the coming election, it's probably Western Australia. And that's because Western Australia is having a massive economic boom as a result of the Chinese demand for our resources. So,
So in terms of the Reserve Bank decision here that's coming in less than 2 weeks, February 18, expectations as to whether they'll cut rates or not, what do you think? Will the trade issue playing out between China and the US be on the agenda at all for them, for the Reserve Bank?
I don't think it changes their decision for this meeting. I mean, I'm of the view that they will cut rates once, but there's not a lot of room in the economy to make substantial cuts. So it's once or twice this year max. The bigger tariff question for them will be, how does it affect our outlook, right? So we might be able to cut rates by 25 basis points, but the question is, where are rates going to be in 12 months? Where are rates going to be in 18, 24 months? And I think to that question, the Trump factor, the tariff factor, these things just introduce significant uncertainty, right? And so for example, what we see is US bonds, interest rates have risen automatically with Trump. And that's because Trump introduces a kind of risk premium, right? Well, no one knows what he's going to do, and so everyone demands a higher return on their savings, right? And that acts as a handbrake, right?
So the uncertainty is going to push up US rates.
And Australian rates, right? So there's a sort of just a general uncertainty, right? So my sense, if I were the RBA, the effect at the margin would be to have a lot less confidence in the future, to have a lot less confidence in any kind of reduction in interest rates going forward. And I would want to sit on my hands to wait and see, what he actually does and what effect it has.
Just before we come back to the Australian economy, the US budget situation. What's that looking like?
Catastrophic.
Right, to put it mildly.
So, I complain a lot about the Australian budget and its lack of sustainability, but we are like a dream compared to America.
Is that
okay,
right?
So the US deficit is $2 trillion, which is enormous.
It's a staggering number.
And the debt is $36 trillion. This is US dollars, right? So $36 trillion. That's around 100% of GDP, right?
Yeah.
So that is starting to get to the point of crisis level. So I mean, there is a genuine limit to how much debt you can issue, right? So, and we don't. The problem with that is it is like playing a game of chicken. You don't quite know when you're going to hit the wall.
Yeah. And
so the problem is. So I'll give you one example. We're adding $2 trillion a year to the debt pile, right? $2 trillion deficit, 36 in the pile. We're to the point with interest rates that the US government is spending more on interest than defence, and they spend an enormous amount on defence, more on interest than Medicare, right? The biggest social program. The Social Security Trust Fund, which is what funds retirees' benefits in the US, is due to be insolvent in the next 5 to 10 years. And the worst thing is that nobody in the US is being serious about solving the problem. Right, so every proposal, every bit of commentary is pushing in the direction of making the deficit larger, not smaller. Right, so I'm really worried about the US fiscal situation, and I think what it does is it raises the real prospect in the next 5 to 10 years of what is effectively another kind of massive global financial crisis, right?
Right.
And so that's kind of looming out there. And if you think about the Trump factor, if you think about political uncertainty in the US,
trade war,
it just
economic crisis.
In that medium-term time frame, I'm genuinely quite nervous.
I think this is really important for Australians to think about, because whoever wins the coming election here is going to have to deal with this, right? Whether it's Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton, these global economic challenges are huge, as you point out. But at least we have, according to Steve Hamilton, dream budget situation.
Hang on, relatively speaking.
But just circling back to, you think we will get a rate cut
in
10 days or so?
I'd be shocked if we didn't.
Really?
I mean, I think there is. I'll give you two reasons. One, the board members, the RBA, would love nothing more than to get the monkey off their back.
Yeah.
Secondly, there is consensus. The market has fully priced a cut. All of the commentators are on board, and senior RBA officials have had months to signal to the market that their impression is wrong. They had plenty of chances to tell the market, hang on, you're a little bit too confident we're going to cut. They let that go. And so if they hold, it has the same economic effect as an increase in rates, right? Because the market's assuming they're going to cut. Yeah. And the RBA doesn't want to surprise the market. So to me, that's an extremely clear signal that the RBA indicates they're ahead of things on inflation. It's coming down a little faster than expected, so we can give people finally, after 15 months,
so cut and then
a little relief.
And then they can sit on it for a while.
And then they will. They won't follow up, I don't think, with a cut the next meeting. They'll say, we'll be data dependent. We've got these uncertainties we want to think about. We'll sit on our hands for a while. I'm
sure there'll be a lot of mortgage holders happy to see at least one rate cut, and a government as well, I suspect as well. But look, Steve, thank you for painting, a rather gloomy picture of the global outlook, but giving us a better understanding of what is going on amidst everything happening this week. Good to catch up. Thank you.
Pleasure, mate.
And if you have any thoughts on this podcast, do drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. I hope to see you Sunday morning from the couch, 9 a.m. Sunday on ABC TV.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.